Today, we're going to review with Reading with Shep, one of my all-time favorite World War One books. I didn't even know this was my favorite. I just got it about 2 weeks ago. I read it and I was blown away. All Quiet on the Western Front. Now, this book is pretty intense. It is the German perspective on World War One, and the Germans had a lot going on. They had a lot of dwindling resources. Arguably, they suffered a lot more. Um, you know, and this book was actively burned by Hitler because it depicted a German loss of World War One, and in Nazi Germany, they weren't having any of that. So basically, it follows a soldier. It's a novel. He's 20 at the time, and his few friends that he has from school and all of their professors and teachers get them to enlist because it was to the point where if you didn't enlist, even your mother would call you a coward. Your own mother, she'd call you a coward. And there was still a romanticized idea of war at the time. Um, you know, they hadn't seen anything like World War One prior to World War One, except for the Russo-Japanese naval war that went on before World War One. Kind of gave us a taste of what modern warfare at the time was going to be like. But that's another story for another day. So this book is great. The writing is phenomenal. The author is very poetic. Like, you just go through, it's just quotables left and right, quotables all day. And what I really liked about this book was how blunt it was, how it just jumps right in. It's not too long, and it's the author just did a phenomenal job depicting everything. I picked out some wonderful quotes from the book. So, all these men go in. They're in their 20s. They're younger than me. I'm 24, and I can't imagine having to go through what they had to go through. The idea of artillery fire, shell shock, the amount of rats that would build up in the trenches, people getting trench foot. I discussed that in my last video. Their feet would freeze to their boot and they wouldn't be able to take their boot off. And, that's what makes the winter campaigns particularly gruesome. Now, I mentioned shell shock and shelling. Shell shock is depicting is when people are overcome by shelling. The idea of having getting shelled on today is kind of obscure, but imagine fireworks going off on ground level right in front of you and shooting metal shards everywhere and just destroying everything in its path. And that's how people would basically live. You want to understand what it's like to live in a trench in World War One. Go dig a hole in your backyard and live in it. That's a quote by Dan Carlin. I'm not going to take credit for that, but here's a depiction of shelling. Every man is aware of the heavy shells tearing down the parapet, rooting up the embankment and demolishing the upper layers of concrete. When a shell lands in a trench, we note how the hollow, furious blast is like a blow from the paw of a raging beast of prey. Already by morning, a few of the recruits are green and vomiting. They are too inexperienced. These new recruits would come in and they wouldn't be able to, they would not be able to handle this. I mean, just um, the sheer sounds and what they witness on the front lines is gruesome. Veteran soldiers wouldn't want anything to do with these new recruits because they weren't reliable. You know, you wouldn't want to get put in with these 19-year-olds when you've already been experiencing this for a year and a half. because a lot of them would just freeze up. The back of this book has a nice little quote that I really enjoy. I am young, I am 20 years old, yet I know nothing of life but despair, death, fear, and voracious superficiality, cast over an abyss of sorrow. An abyss of sorrow. That's such a powerful, powerful sentence. Now, this quote is depicting active combat and what it's like in words. The lines behind us stop. They can advance no further. The attack is crushed by our artillery. We watch. The fire lifts 100 yards and we break forward. Besides me, a lance corporal has his head torn off. He runs a few steps more while the blood spurts from his neck like a fountain. That sounds like a chicken with his head cut off. It does not come quite to hand fighting. They are driven back. We arrive again at our shattered trench and pass beyond it. Oh, this running back again. We reach the shelter of the reserves and yearn to creep in and disappear, but instead we must turn around and plunge again into the horror. We were not asthmata at that moment. We would continue lying there, exhausted and without will, but we were swept forward again, powerless, madly savage and raging. We will kill, for they are still our mortal enemies. Their rifles and bombs are aimed against us, and if we don't destroy them, they will destroy us. That's the mentality that they keep throughout the war. It's either them or us. And many of these young guys, they don't know how to handle it. Like I said earlier, the recruits, they come in and they just go mad. They go crazy. It's really hard to fathom. Speaking of new recruits, another big trope of World War One is gas. The gas that they'd use in World War One was sulfur, chlorine, stuff like that. It would get into your lungs and burn physically. Gas masks were a new thing at the time. And if you look up YouTube videos on the different types of gas masks, they all look creepy. They all look very scary. It's like a Halloween costume. But they saved lives. And you needed to be rehearsed in when to take them off, when to keep them on, what to listen for when you can hear gas coming, you can smell it, and rarely you can see it even. This quote is talking about the people who die of gas. It brings a lump into the throat to see how they go over and run and fall, referring to the new recruits. A man would like to spank them. They are so stupid. And to take them by the arm and lead them away from here where they have no business to be. They wear gray coats and trousers and boots, but for most of them, the uniform is far too big. It hangs on their limbs, their shoulders are too narrow, their bodies are too slight. No uniform was ever made for these childish measurements. Between 5 and 10 recruits fall to every old hand. So 5 and 10 new recruits die for every seasoned veteran that is on the front lines. A surprise gas attack carries off a lot of them. They have not yet learned what to do. We find one dugout full of them, with blue heads and black lips. Some of them, in shell holes, took off their masks too soon. They did not know that the gas lies longest in the hollows, referring to the trench. When they saw others on the top without masks, they pulled theirs off, too, and swallowed enough to scorch their lungs. Their condition is hopeless. They choke to death, with hemorrhages and suffocation. I think you all understood that. They saw people up above the trench take off their mask, but little did they know that it stays down in the trench. So they took it off prematurely, and they're done. it's so easy to lose your life in World War One. There's so many different ways. It's really terrifying. In one quote, Paul goes home, and going home to him is kind of a tease because he doesn't know if he's really gonna be home permanently, and he goes on leave for a little bit, goes back to his childhood house, his room. He looks at his butterfly collection and realizes how much he's changed and how the sights that he saw in war are not things he can really talk about. And in this quote, his mother asks him, his mother's name is Erna. Erna takes away the food. Suddenly, my mother seizes hold of my hand and asks frightenedly, "Was it very bad out there, Paul?" Mother, what should I answer to that? You would not understand. You could never realize it, and you shall never realize it. Was it bad, you ask? You, mother? I shake my head and say, no, mother, not so very. There are always a lot of us together, so it's not so bad. And then his mother replies, yes, but Heinrich Brudemir was here just lately and said it was terrible out there, with the gas and all the rest of it. It is my mother who says that. She says, with the gas and all the rest of it. She does not know what she is saying. She is merely anxious for me. Should I tell her how we once found 3 enemy trenches with their garrisons all stiff, as though stricken by epilepsy? Against the parapet in the dugouts just where they were, the men stood and lay about, with blue faces, dead. No, mother, that's all talk, I answer. There's not very much in the Brudermere says. You see, for instance, I'm well and fit. Before my mother's tremendous anxiety, I recover my composure. Now I can walk about and talk and answer questions without fear of having suddenly to lean against the wall, because the world turns soft as rubber and my veins become brimstone. So he can't express any of this to his mother, and he feels on the inside that they'll never understand. How will she understand? You know what they say about people in war. People who have been there and done that and shot people, they don't talk about it because that's traumatic. And I'm sure it's the case in World War One. This next quote is very interesting. And it kind of describes the mentality of when you first get to the front as opposed to being on the front for a long time. Much terror can be endured so long as a man simply ducks, but it kills if a man thinks about it. So, to think about what's going on would overwhelm anybody. But if you simply just go with it, you'll survive. And that's very interesting to me because there's a million different ways to get killed in World War One. And it seems that, like they said earlier, they said that for every old recruit, 5 or 10 new recruits would die. So it comes with experience as well. And the mere fact that people were able to survive this war all the way through, and some even serve in World War II later on, just baffles my mind. Another common trope of World War One is shell fire. Plenty of it happens in World War II, but it's used to an extreme in World War One. The idea of shell fire is kind of obscure to us today, but shell fire is essentially, think cannons shooting bits of metal and rusty metal and all sorts of fragments that shoot out and scatter like a shotgun. And many people would get hit by such things. And it was definitely a huge casualty absorber. That, barbed wire, artillery, stuff like that. This quote depicts heavy shelling and how the new recruits would deal with it. Every man is aware of the heavy shells tearing down the parapet, rooting up the embankment, and demolishing the upper layer of concrete. When a shell lands in a trench, we note how the hollow, furious blast is like a blow from the paw of a raging beast of prey. Already by morning, a few of the recruits are green and vomiting. They're too inexperienced. So seasoned veterans get used to the shelling. Shelling is like a firework set off at base level or a rocket ship going off. That sound that permeates through your body and you physically feel the sound. It's like that. It's like one person said it was like going down a roller coaster. The feeling that you get in the pit of your stomach when one of those shells goes down is much like going down on a roller coaster. And I see that as a very good example of what it would be like to be under shell fire. Hellfire, as some people called it. Another very common trope of World War One is the amount of rats. You see, the rats would feed on dead bodies, and they'd often eat the food that the soldiers had. And the soldiers didn't have much good food. The Germans, in particular, were known for their bully beef and sausage. They had great meat, and the Germans were fed well at the beginning, second year of the war, but as it went on, it got really sparse, and people would have died to eat the bread that the rats chewed on. But here's a great quote regarding the rats and how they dealt with them. The rats here are particularly repulsive. They are so fat, the kind we all call corpse rats. They have shocking, evil, naked faces, and it is nauseating to see their long, nude tails. They seem to be mighty hungry. Also, every man has had his bread gnawed. Crop wrapped his in his waterproof sheet and put it under his head, but he cannot sleep because they run over his face to get at it. To turn meant to outwit them. He fastened a thin wire to the roof and suspended his bread from it. During the night, when he switched on his pocket torch, he saw the wire swing to and fro. On the bread was riding a fat rat. At least we put a stop to it. We cannot afford to throw the bread away because then we should have nothing left to eat in the morning. So we carefully cut off the bits of bread that the animals have gnawed. The slices we cut off are heaped together in the middle of the floor, which every man takes up his spade and lies down prepared to strike. Deterring Crop and Cat hold their pocket torches ready. After a few minutes we hear the first shuffling and tugging. It grows. Now it is the sound of many little feet. Then the torches switch on and every man strikes at the heap. So basically, they would take all the little pieces of bread that had the rat's bit into it, and they'd cut the rat bites out of it, put it all in the center, and let all the rats come at it, and then they beat them with clubs. And there's a lot of pictures of people basically hunting the rats. So they'd hang up the rats on strings like birds and ducks, like a hunter would. And that was just one of the activities that they did there. And imagine sleeping at night in a trench in in dirt and having rats crawl on you. It's just oof, it gives me like chills just thinking about it. It sounds absolutely terrible. In conclusion, just as I stated, this is one of my favorite World War One books. It's for sure my favorite. You know, the author is poetic. The scenes of gruesome death and destruction and sorrow are all beautiful in a sense by the way that they're depicted. I highly recommend this book. It's not very long, only about 200 and some change, and it's for readers of all ages. I could read this in high school. I could read this in middle school. I believe there's a movie about it. I haven't seen it. I'm currently reading Band of Brothers, and I haven't seen that either. I'm not really a movie guy, I'm more of a book guy. And yeah, well, that's all for All Quiet on the Western Front. Definitely pick it up. The book itself is history, and please recommend more books to me. I love history. World War One, World War Two. I like Russian history. I want to get a book on the Russian World War One experience and the Russian World War Two experience. That really interests me personally. Um, yeah, so I hope you enjoyed this. Please recommend some books for me to read so I can read some more. That's all I want to do. Thank you.